is Will Prince, and I am the Director of Development and Membership with Louisiana Trust for Historic Preservation. We are continuing our video series today with our cultural conversations discussing trends and topics in the world of historic preservation. Today we're meeting with Gaynell Brady of our Mammys. Good morning, Gaynell. How are you today?
I'm great. How are you?
Doing all right. Thank you. Thank you for joining us today. We're really excited to have these conversations and connect to different topics and thoughts across preservation. But before we get started, if you could tell us a little bit more about yourself and your background.
Sure. So I am a museum educator, interpreter, historian, and genealogist. Like I do everything around this. I even do a little bit of sewing. And so that's like my passions. I've had years of experience working at Louisiana State Museum. I was at the National World War II Museum, also with the National Park Service for a number of years. I have been in the world of interpretation and museums for a long time. So I would say almost a good bit of my life. But I love this stuff. I really do.
That's awesome. It's always important to be passionate of it and enjoy what you're learning about and what you're doing.
Yes.
So how did you get into genealogy? What did you study and what were some of the research, what are some resources to learn, about how to learn about genealogy?
So I started with genealogy very early on in life. I'm one of those people that kind of like, I love nagging my grandmother and asking all of those difficult questions. My timing, if anyone has ever attended my genealogy talks, I get into that story a little bit more in depth, but my timing for asking those questions were always at the wrong time of the day for my grandma. Like she was literally watching a soap opera. She didn't want to answer a lot of those questions, but I was always curious. And I had parents that exposed me to a lot of cultural institutions. And I was always like asked, like when I see something on the wall at an exhibit or when we were like visiting like a historical site, I was always trying to figure out like, where did my family, fit into all of this? And when I was in my teens, my dad took us to his aunt's, that would be his aunt, my great aunt's house. And I just thought she had a really huge backyard, William. I had no idea she was still living on a plantation. And it wasn't until later on when I started doing genealogy officially in 2007, that all of those pieces of all those different events and life experiences just kind of tied together. Grateful to my local libraries, New Orleans Public Library and Jefferson Parish Libraries. They were like my huge, huge sources of information and help. Sal Sirio over at Jefferson Parish Library had this wonderful series on genealogy. And he kind of like mentored me along the way. I would really give Sal like huge props for that. And he just taught me that even though he, primarily focused on Italian American history, that, hey, all of these things start off the same. It's just when you get further back, things start to change a little bit for my story. So New Orleans Public Library and Sal Sirio at Jefferson Parish Library. That's my start.
Great. So as you research and kind of get interested in different topics or, sites or different things, how does genealogy fit into historic preservation in the big picture? How do genealogists play a role in preservation from small sites to big sites to the big narrative? How does genealogy fit into the historic preservation realm?
Well, one of the things I do in my genealogy courses, I encourage people to visit the places where their ancestors came from, right? Whether if it's a huge town or huge city like New Orleans, or if it's a little tiny town like Bogalusa, Louisiana. And one of the things that I tell people to do is look for the places where your ancestors worked. Look for those buildings, those things that even though you may not have something written, those buildings are tangible evidence that your ancestors were here. And those things tie in together because as you learn more about the building, you get to learn more about your ancestors' work conditions and their lifestyles. When we don't have the buildings, William, we've lost another piece of the puzzle, especially for African Americans. I know that some people have a difficult time understanding why I support the preservation of plantations, but I keep trying to tell them that even in those buildings, there are a lot of painful memories there, but that's your history. And when we lose those buildings, when they fall apart, we lose again that tangible evidence that they were there. They built those walls. Like for me, I can't describe the feeling I get when I get to put my hands on the same wall that my ancestors touched. We need to do everything we can to preserve those buildings. I know everybody loves the newness and the new modern features, but I think there's so much to be said about a building that's 300 years old, that has withstand like so many of our tropical and natural disasters, right? That speaks to the people who built them. So it all fits in together. It's one big part of that puzzle.
Yeah, and when we lose, like you said, when we lose those places and they become, whether it's a vacant lot or a new construction, you know, you don't have that same connection. You don't, you know, you can't say this is, you know, like you said, your ancestors or, you know, whoever, what happened here, there's been cases where, you know, this might have been a cool concert venue, but now it's a parking lot. You know, that's no fun.
It's not.
And it's not the same connection or feeling or, you know, appreciation in the long end. So I appreciate that. So when you are researching a site or a person, what are some of the first things you do? And if you could take us a little bit step by step of your genealogy research process, or like, you know, I'm sure there's rabbit holes that come about, but you know, what are some of the essential or must do actions or activities or go-to places? I know you mentioned the library, but if you could kind of give us some examples of you know, whether it's a concrete example or kind of in the field activity, what are some of the resources that you use?
So I'll use my grandmother, Belle Jefferson, and folks who know me know that I've never met this woman, but I talk about her like I did. She's actually my second great grandmother. So I really, with all of their lives, I don't spend as what I call the rat race of running up to the top to see how far back I can get in my tree. I really want to get to know that person. So for Mama Belle, I really started with oral histories. I started with the stories that people knew about her, the people who grew up with her, and they shared information with me. And at that point, I kind of connected that to information that I found at the libraries, of course, with the census records and stuff. But William, I wanted to take it a step further. Once I started to piece together her lives, I looked at her obituary, looked at some of the clubs and organizations that kind of like were in the obituary. I also, from the directories, and I learned where she worked. And once I figured out where she worked, I wanted to learn more about that company. So I turned to the Historic New Orleans Collection. And then it was, once again, I wanted to see where that building was in New Orleans. Now today it's True Value Hardware on Magazine Street. So of course, the first thing I did was ran up to Magazine Street to try to see the building, and then just kept working my way back with her. One of the things that African Americans have to do when we study genealogy, we can't just study our family, but also study the families that are connected with our families. So I knew that they were from Clinton. I knew that they lived near Norwood, Louisiana. So I wanted to understand that landscape. So sometimes we have to look at the history of the area, the industries of the areas. Like I knew from oral history that Mama Belle's husband, Alex Jefferson, worked in the sawmill industry. So I looked at those places in Clinton, Louisiana. I also knew from oral history the family moved to Bayou Zelma, also known as Des Salmons. And that was the sawmill there. So it took me a lot of bouncing around, looking at old newspapers, another huge resource for African Americans. But in addition to that was the history of the church. So histories of churches is a long process, but before I can do any of that, I had to connect myself to Mama Belle. Like, how is she related to me? And work my way backwards. So it's so many different pieces that you have to pull together, and some of the resources are not traditional. I had to turn to clubs, as I mentioned, organizations, to try to piece together her life. But it can be done. It totally can be done.
Are there any like key, like when you're doing this research, particularly like with the newspaper, are there any like keywords you use? Like you mentioned the sawmill and so forth. So
Mm-hmm.
do you build off of that, or do you build off the address, or is there, I'm sure every case is different, but is there terms or words that
Yeah,
are not that you wouldn't think, but maybe kind of make a connection?
yeah, for me, and I again, like I said, because of African American genealogy, there are some keywords that are not very friendly today.
Mhm.
But oftentimes when you're looking for African American genealogy, you have to use terms like colored, this. But in the case of my bell, when I was looking for the company name, I just typed in the company name and put it in quotation marks and the city and the approximate dates. So that helped me with that. Um, Negro is another word you may have to, to narrow down your search to make sure you're pulling up the right person. But that's why it's so important before you even touch the newspapers to build that family tree to make sure you have the right person.
Great. So what have been some of the more impactful ways that you have found to connect with audiences through storytelling, whether it's through on-site, virtually, just different ways that you connect with audiences, young, old, and between, and especially with difficult history, whether it's slavery and plantations or civil rights, or whether it's a site-specific event that happened at that place or within that family. So what are the ways to connect through audiences through that storytelling and interpretation?
So I've done this in one of two ways. I'll share two powerful examples that I've done with a group of very, very young kids. Like people always say, hey, you can't talk about this with kids. Kids are awesome, right? Like if you can take something so simple and make it relevant to them, they'll understand it. So I'll give you two examples. I did a program at a summer camp in New Orleans, and it was with a group of 6-year-olds. And I told them a story about a young lady who was in New Orleans. She was living on a plantation in Baton Rouge, and she came to New Orleans because she heard that her daughter was taken to New Orleans to be sold. And she heard that they were holding her daughter in Algiers. And so the kids understood where Algiers was. And I said, I don't know how to get there. And so they asked me all these questions. Well, how did you get here? And I told her there were people who helped me along the way, and they got me to this point. So I'm in New Orleans, but I'm just trying to figure out how to get to Algiers, but you can't tell anyone I'm here. And so I said, and so the kids are like, what do you need? What do you need? Do you want us to write down the directions? I said, no, draw me a map and use like things that that I can recognize to get to Algiers. William, you should see these maps. I still have them around here somewhere. I just have to find them. But the kids drew me maps, including the interstate system, on how to get to Algiers, with images of the Superdome, like using key things that I should see along the way to make sure I'm going the right way. And basically, if you think about it, in a way, I described the Underground Railroad. In a way, I described how people went to go and find their loved ones in their quest for freedom. And so the kids, in the macro sense, wouldn't understand that, but they got their first exposure at how the Underground Railroad actually worked, and understanding that I had friends along the way to help me to get to a certain destination. And the teachers were like, whoa, because the kids were serious. Like they wanted me to go and find my daughter. I did another thing at Chalmette Battlefield. And there were all of these different stops set up. And I was one of the stops on there, and I was portraying a woman whose child was taken. And I didn't know if the British took my child or if someone else took my child, and my husband ran off to go and find my child. And so I told them, I said, the British told me that I would be free if I would go with them. Should I trust them? And the kids were like, wait a minute. And so they were so fierce. It was so funny. My coworker was like, Gaynell, and he was portraying the British. He said, you need to give me heads up, dude, when you're doing that type of stuff, because the kids kept coming up to Nathan throughout the night. He was dressed as a British officer. You better not trick her. Don't trick her. And go and help her find her daughter. And they held on to this. And like, it was so funny because it was a nighttime event. And I had worked that day, maybe 12 hours at this camp out event, and I was exhausted, still in my clothes, but no shoes on, waiting for my ride to go home. When the kids came up to me and said, "Did you ever find your husband?" And this was like 10 o'clock at night. And I'm like, "Baby, he'll be here in just a moment. You see that Chevy Impala that's coming? He's right there." But they were really drawn into it.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the power of storytelling, especially when you do it at those historical sites. The fact that we were on the battlefield, I had the levee and the river behind me. We had the trees, we had all the historical buildings. They understood. And the thing is that we can take these complicated topics and break them into more manageable pieces. But the piece that we need to do is just make sure that we're telling the truth so that we could build the trust. And again, those kids trusted me. Like, they really wanted to help me find my child, William. They were all over the battlefields with little flashlights trying to find her. And I did it through first person, which is very challenging for me because the educator side of me kind of sticks out and says, okay, let's look at the data and let's figure out what's going on here. But I did it in first person because I wanted to create a powerful moment for them. And it worked. It really worked.
Yeah, it ties that experience all together, 200, 300 years apart in that sense of place, but also kind of just a new, not a new way of looking at it, but just it's just about the experience. That's the only way I can put it. It's that experiential, I know in the tourism industry, it's all about like, learning how to make this and how on site and like, making the type of food. Same thing, experiencing that kind of culture, that activity in the sense, whether it's through play or like the map making. That's a great way for them to better understand their community and also the activity and events through history and how it has changed or how it hasn't changed.
Right.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Well, this has been great information and great ways to learn about maybe taking steps to interpret or connect with different groups, or especially the youth. I love it. Do you have any other words of wisdom or advice or last recommendations for way we interpret or approach interpretation and genealogy in the field of preservation?
I do. One of the things that I have been really pushing, especially since the pandemic, is starting with ourselves, documenting our histories, working on yourself. Start journaling, start talking about your experiences the first time you walked into this building, the first time you visited this place, so that people can start to understand like how our lives would be so different if we didn't have these places.
Great. Well, thank you so much. I appreciate your time today and learning more about the world of genealogy and interpretation. And I love the stories about the kids and how they're learning more about preservation and their heritage. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.